way to defend against Taliban insurgents. Sending in more U.S. combat troops is not the answer, nor is just building up a central army in Kabul. Reaching out to the villages and tribal elders and establishing local militias, perhaps buying their goodwill if need be, and these are the things that will work. And it will cost a pittance compared to $35 billion more per year for 35,000 more troops who may end up turning off the people of Afghanistan rather than enlisting them to our side. Opposing our enemy by arming and financing local and village leaders was a strategy that worked against the Soviet Army, and it worked against the Taliban after 9/11, and it will work again. Let us admit that our goals, these last 7 years, that the goals that we have actually tried to put in place these last 7 years were wrong. The goals were wrong, not just the implementation. The goals were wrong. Honest and decentralized government in Afghanistan should have been the goal. Decentralized, honest and decentralized, perhaps representative government in Afghanistan should have been the goal, not creating a central power so you can't have a real country unless you really have a government in charge in the capital that then controls the rest of the country. That was a total illusion, and it was wrong. It was never something we could have accomplished. Instead, what we wanted to do, instead of a decentralized government, we wanted to establish a national power, and we wanted to have national power wielders with whom we could do business. Karzai was never someone who had any loyalty of the Afghan people. He was not a political force in that country. We forced Karzai on the Afghan people after 9/11. And we forced the king into a more subservient role when he returned, rather than a role where he could have selected true Afghan leaders to help rebuild their country. Leaders that would have been honest, instead of what we have now in the Karzai administration, which is nothing more than a kleptocracy, gangster regime. In the United States, our schools are run locally. Remember this. Our schools are run locally. Our police are run locally. The criminal justice system is run at the state or local level. Now what would have happened if somebody had come into our country during the American Revolution and said, no, we have to reconfigure it so all the power is in Washington and all the appointees are going to be in Washington, D.C., and that's where all the power is going to be, and you're going to have a centralized government. Our founding fathers would have revolted against that because that wasn't consistent with how we knew that freedom was going to be preserved, wasn't consistent with representative government and democracy. No, we wouldn't have done that. Well, in Afghanistan, let me just note, what we've got there in Afghanistan and what we've tried to establish in Afghanistan is a Kabul-based centralization of authority. And that is, especially when that authority, and how can we expect the people of Afghanistan to accept something, centralization of power, which is totally contrary to their own decentralized society, which they've had for thousands of years. How do we expect them to accept that, especially when the centralized authority that we're trying to foist on them has been corrupt and in no way reflects the consent of the governed? Members of parliament there have are elected by a slate. The people there in that country don't have individual districts that represent them, individual congressmen who are elected from individual districts, or they aren't even elected at specific villages. No, there is not one person in that government who most people in Afghanistan can identify as someone for whom they voted for to represent them. Not in the parliament, not in the Kabul government, because there's no congressman that are elected. They're elected at a province-wide level, which means it's a slate, and almost all the villages, nobody knows anybody on the slate, because the slate is dictated politically from Kabul, which of course is a corrupt center of power. Do we expect the Afghan people to just accept orders from people who they haven't voted for, who they don't know, and the corruption and the ineptitude of that central authority, of course, which we have foisted upon them, is not an acceptable alternative. We're not giving them an acceptable alternative. No wonder why the Taliban is being considered. All this means that local people who have no honest system to settle disputes, to determine rights, or to organize the effort that's needed to elevate the condition of this suffering and poverty-stricken people. These people are devout, but they're not fanatics. But they will acquiesce again to the Taliban Islamic fringe if it is at least honest and at its core, and if it is compared to visiting crooks who are claiming the right to make decisions that have the finality and power of law, but people who they don't even know who they are, much less have voted for them. What we do now is what we should have done originally. Let the local villages appoint their own elders to positions of local authority. Let them pick a wise person who they know to be a judge and make decisions for them locally. Let the village militias become part of a national guard. Give them uniforms. Give them guns and ammunition. Give them communication gear. And use the Central Army to back them up, not to disarm them for fear of their sympathies. And yes, the U.S. can remain a major military force in Afghanistan, but we cannot and will not succeed if we believe our military forces, foreign fighters in a foreign land, can bring a recognizable military victory. Adding more troops feeds the illusion that we can win some kind of victory if we just exercise more power and send more military personnel. Alexander the Great left the bones of his entourage there, as did the British and, yes, the Russians. The sword has never conquered these people. It may be for a limited time, and it may, for a limited time, give an appearance of stability, but instead will feed a simmering antipathy that will not cool, but only grow hotter and more ferocious. Again, we can defeat any army. We cannot conquer and subdue the nation of Afghanistan. Only Afghans from the bottom up can control and pacify their countryside. There is still time for our action in Afghanistan to end with honor and success. For the Afghans and for the Americans, they can still have a great ending to all of this. The first step towards that is to signal to the whole nation of Afghanistan. Send them a message heard in every corner of those 4,500 villages, and that is that the United States is not trying to foist upon them a corrupt central government. To accomplish this, we must recognize the travesty of this last election. And while we cannot have an entirely new election, we can insist on a runoff between Mr. Karzai and Abdullah. In this runoff election, a respected international organization, perhaps the OSCE, could be given a free hand to correct problems as they appear and throw out illegal ballots if necessary. After the election, we should commit ourselves to a new course that respects the traditional village structure and reaches out with assistance to improve health, water, education, and agriculture in Afghanistan. Yes, at first, the risk of such a plan will be great for the individuals who are willing to go to the front lines with our helping hand offensive. But this approach, a helping hand, will be far more effective than a mailed fist approach. It will take money. We may need to begin to buy goodwill. Maybe we need to offer to put some people on consulting fees at the local level. Some of these local leaders and village elders. Well, that can be done, and we can also do things like, for example, some expenditures that prove our good faith, like setting up clinics or schools or economic projects that will improve the life of those villagers. It may take courage, and we will lose some people. And in the end, the expense and the loss of life will be far less than a warrior-focused alternative. And yes, fighting will be necessary. The Taliban are evil. They are inseparable from Al-Qaeda because